The conference hall of Cole Global Holdings shimmered with marble pillars, gold lighting, and the famous centerpiece everyone in the city had heard of, a custom Italian glass desk worth more than most people would earn in 10 years. It was a symbol of billionaire Alexander Khalifa's power, pride and ego, and on this particular evening, standing quietly near that desk was a humble janitor, Patrick, who had brought his 12-year-old son Elijah to work because he could not leave him alone at home. Elijah, curious and innocent, admired the desk with wide eyes, gently placing his small hand on the polished surface at that exact second. Alexander walked in. He froze, his face twisted, and without warning, he unleashed his outrage in front of executives, staff, and interns. "How dare you touch something that costs more than your father's yearly salary?" He thundered. Gasps filled the room. Patrick stood speechless, and before anyone could breathe, Alexander shouted the words that changed everything. "You're fired, both of you. Get out of my building." The room went silent. No one knew that this moment, witnessed in shame and tears, was the beginning of Alexander's greatest downfall. Patrick had never missed a day of work in 14 years. Long before the skyscrapers surrounding Cole Global pierced the skyline, long before Alexander Khalifa became one of the wealthiest and most feared businessmen in the country, Patrick had been pushing cleaning carts through unfinished floors, scrubbing away dust while construction workers hammered beams overhead. He believed in something simple and permanent. A man's honor is measured not by how much he earns, but by how sincerely he earns it every morning. Before the sun even washed the city in gray light, Patrick would pray, bow his head, and step out of their modest one-room apartment with a quiet dignity. Work was not humiliation, it was survival with pride. And beside him, on many difficult days, walked his son Elijah, a boy whose curiosity seemed larger than the city itself. Elijah was 12, but already his teachers whispered that he was blossoming into something extraordinary. When most children played with plastic toys, Elijah collected discarded circuit boards, broken phone chargers, and old calculator pieces from the trash pile behind their building. He would wire them together, experiment with batteries, and sit for hours watching tiny bulbs flicker with life. "Daddy," he once said, eyes shining, "machines talk if you listen." Patrick didn't fully understand, but he loved watching his son's mind bloom like a wild tree. He told him the same words every night: "Never let our conditions silence your potential. Kings are not born in palaces. They are born in silence and revealed by destiny." Elijah carried those words with him like a secret crown. The world of Alexander Khalifa. Alexander Khalifa lived in a world that worshipped wealth. His offices stretched across the top 3 floors of the city's most luxurious corporate tower. The carpets were imported. The wall art was insured higher than the price of most suburban homes. And even the doorknobs were custom engraved with initials to Alexander. These weren't decorations, they were declarations of power. He came from privilege. His father had built the first branch of the business, and Alexander inherited not just the company, but the belief that success was proof of superiority, and poverty was evidence of inferiority. In executive meetings, he often said things like, "People who work at the bottom belong there if they wanted better lives. They do better." Employees feared him not because he shouted, though he did, but because he never forgot humiliation. One small mistake could mean demotion, exile, or the cold sentence, "Clean out your desk, security will escort you." Rumors whispered through the halls of Cole Global. Senior manager dismissed for disagreeing with him. A designer pushed out of the building for submitting a proposal 1 hour late. A secretary who cried in the elevator after being fired on her birthday. No one confronted him, not the board, not HR, not the legal department. His money made him untouchable, and the worst symbol of his ego was the one centerpiece of his entire empire: the Italian handcrafted glass desk, carved, shaped, and polished by a master craftsman. Alexander called it the desk that proves I made it. Some said he worshipped it more than his own board of directors. Elijah came to the office the day everything changed. Patrick woke to find that his neighbor, who normally watched Elijah, had been rushed to the hospital with no relatives in the city and no money to pay someone else. He faced only one choice: take the boy with him. Patrick stood at the small kitchen sink as Elijah, still sleepy, rubbed his eyes. "Daddy, I can stay by myself. I'm not a small boy anymore." Patrick shook his head. "Your mother always said a child cannot protect himself alone in this world, and she was right." Elijah's mother had passed away 3 years earlier, a silent grief that sat in every corner of their apartment since then. Father and son leaned on each other like two reeds in the same storm. Patrick packed a simple meal, tucked Elijah's notebook and small toolkit into his worn backpack, and the two walked the 45 minutes to the financial district, because even bus fare had to be saved inside the building. Employees greeted Patrick with respectful nods. He was one of the few staff members who treated everyone with warmth. Security guards, receptionists, delivery drivers, they all knew him. "Morning, Mr. Addo," they smiled. "Good morning, Elijah. Ready to build another robot?" Elijah grinned shyly. Despite everything, he was loved here. A lesson before the storm. While Patrick mopped the upper floor corridor, Elijah sat nearby reading diagrams of simple machines. He had drawn a little robot arm that could lift a weight using basic leverage. "Daddy," he whispered as the building echoed with executive high heels and expensive perfume. "Sometimes I don't understand how people who have everything can still look so angry." Patrick paused, resting on his mop handle, and smiled gently. "Son, money does not make the heart rich. Some people have everything except peace, and some people, like us, have almost nothing but sleep with restful souls." Elijah absorbed the words. He always did. Moment that changed everything. Then, while Patrick was cleaning the boardroom floor, Elijah stepped forward and ran his hand over the shimmering surface of Alexander's famous glass desk. It wasn't mischief, it was admiration. The desk, under the soft lights, looked like a frozen slice of ocean. Crystal, the edges sparkled. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. Elijah's fingers traced the perfect polish like someone appreciating a masterpiece. He didn't know that the owner of the masterpiece was approaching. The heavy glass doors slid open. Silence fell. Executives, still reviewing their digital charts, froze. The air became thick enough to taste, and then the voice came, sharp, cold, slicing through the room like a blade of winter steel. "What do you think you're touching?" Elijah spun around, eyes wide. Patrick dropped his mop. There, in a tailored midnight suit and a stare full of imperial fury, stood Alexander Khalifa, the man who believed dirt existed only on people, never on himself. Alexander looked from the boy to the desk, then to Patrick, and his lips curled with contempt. "You brought a child onto my executive floor, into my office, to put his hands on something worth more than your yearly salary." Patrick bowed his head, voice trembling. "Sir, forgive him. He is nothing," Alexander snapped. "And now? So you pack your things, you're fired." The room went silent. Someone swallowed, someone looked away, someone else recorded silently. Heart pounding. Patrick's world collapsed, not because he lost the job, but because his son had been spoken to like a stain. Waste. Elijah felt tears burn behind his eyes. Patrick placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come, son," he whispered. No one knew, not Alexander, not the executives, not the cleaning staff, that this moment was the beginning of a downfall so poetic, so dramatic, that even destiny would seem to be watching. Patrick and Elijah walked out of the towering headquarters in silence, their footsteps swallowed by the rumble of city traffic. The evening air had cooled, and the city lights flickered across their faces, but neither of them felt the beauty of the skyline. Patrick held his small work bag in one hand and Elijah's trembling fingers in the other. They were moving, but both of them felt frozen inside. People passed them on the sidewalk without knowing that life had just fallen apart in a single moment of humiliation. It was not the loss of the job that weighed on Patrick's chest. It was the feeling of being dismissed as nothing in front of his own child. Elijah kept stealing small glances up at his father, unsure how to speak. He had always believed his father was the strongest man in the world, a man who could face storms without breaking. Seeing him this quite frightened him more than Alexander Khalifa's anger had. Finally, Elijah whispered, "Daddy, I'm sorry." His voice trembled with guilt. With the fear that his small touch on a piece of glass had changed their future forever, Patrick stopped walking, knelt down and cupped his son's face with both hands. "You are not the reason I lost my job," he said softly, voice steady in a way only a father could master after heartbreak. "A man who has no respect for others cannot take anything from us. Only God gives, only God measures value." Elijah swallowed, but tears spilled down his cheeks. They embraced for a moment, a silent agreement that they had each other. Even if the world turned its back, then they continued the long walk home. Patrick placed his work shirt carefully into the bucket of water where he usually soaked his clothes after his shift. But tonight he did not scrub, he simply stared at the submerged fabric, watching the surface ripple, feeling something inside him ripple too. Their apartment was small, one room with peeling paint, a tiny stove, and two beds side by side, yet it had always felt safe tonight. It felt tight, uncertain, heavy with the unknown. Elijah pulled open his box of wires and broken electronics. But even his inventions could not distract him. He sat on the floor beside his father and finally found the courage to ask, "Daddy, what will we do?" It was a fair question and a heavy one. Patrick took a deep breath and forced his voice to remain calm. "We do what we have always done. We get up tomorrow, we continue. The wind is strongest before the rain ends." Elijah nodded slowly, but he was not convinced. He had seen other children in their neighborhood drop out of school when money ran out. He had seen families split, seen furniture sold, seen the slow sinking of people who began to drown quietly. He did not want that fate for them. He wanted to fix things that night. Long after Patrick fell asleep, Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor and scribbled diagrams, inventions that might help them earn money. Machines he had no parts to build. His pencil scratched the paper furiously, his young heart determined to help the man who had carried their world alone for years. The next morning, Patrick woke before sunrise as he always did. Out of habit rather than necessity, he picked up the bucket of water, poured it out, washed his shirt by hand, and hung it to dry. Even though he no longer had a shift to prepare for, routine was comfort, routine was survival. Something was missing though, the anticipation of purpose, the silent promise of a day's labor. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands. They were rough, calloused, shaped by years of pushing carts, filling buckets, scrubbing floors. They were the hands of a man who worked for dignity, not for approval. Elijah stirred and rubbed his eyes. "Daddy, are you okay?" Patrick forced a small smile. "I am alive, my son. That means we keep moving." Elijah nodded slowly, then stood and packed his school books. He hesitated before stepping out the door. "What if they laugh at me at school?" he asked quietly. "What if they heard?" Patrick placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "If someone laughs at you, it speaks about their heart, not your worth. Walk in with your head high." Elijah didn't feel brave, but he obeyed. When he stepped into school, he kept his eyes low, half expecting whispers, but no one said anything. Not yet. Life was still normal, at least outside their home. He sat in class and waited for lessons to begin, trying to focus on equations while his mind replayed the voice of Alexander Khalifa shouting, "He is nothing." The words burned deeper than the memory of the glass desk. While Elijah was at school, Patrick walked the streets looking for work. He visited restaurants, cleaning services, hotel lobbies, and malls. Each place took one cursory look at his outdated resume and shook their heads. The city was full of unemployed people, and most businesses preferred younger staff. After 5 hours of rejection, Patrick sat on a bench near a bus stop, staring at the city that seemed to move at a pace he could no longer keep up with. A street vendor passed and offered him a small bag of roasted peanuts. Patrick shook his head, but the man smiled and said, "For you, sir, you look like someone who needs a kindness today." Patrick's eyes stung with gratitude. He accepted the small packet for a moment. He wondered if people like this vendor, simple, compassionate, unrecognized, were wealthier in soul than Alexander Khalifa. With all his imported glass and polished walls, he ate slowly, almost reverently, and then continued his walk. By late afternoon, Patrick returned home with tired legs and no success. The room smelled of boiling rice and vegetables. Allegra was cooking, something he rarely did alone. When Patrick entered, Elijah turned with a nervous smile. "I wanted you to rest when you came home." Patrick smiled softly despite the day's failures. This small gesture warmed him more than food ever could. They ate together quietly that evening. Elijah folded his notebook open and showed his father a drawing. "Daddy, I want to help. I can fix machines. Maybe I can make something we can sell." The drawing was of a simple hand-powered light generator, something that could work without electricity. Patrick's heart clenched. "With love and sadness, you are a child," he said gently. "Your job is to learn. My job is to make sure you can." But Elijah shook his head. "You always carried me. Let me carry you once." Patrick couldn't speak. His throat tightened. He stood and walked to the window, pretending to look outside until he could breathe again. Meanwhile, on the top floors of Cole Global, the atmosphere was very different. The board of directors had gathered for the final rehearsal of a high-profile press conference scheduled for the next morning. It was not just any press briefing. It was the announcement of a new multi-million-dollar partnership with international investors. Alexander planned to deliver the speech standing behind his famous glass desk, the symbol of his empire, power, and infallibility. Executives rehearsed the lighting, teleprompters, camera angles, and seating arrangements. Everyone knew Alexander wanted perfection. No mistakes, no delays, no excuses. If someone mispronounced a word, Alexander would comment. If someone stood 1 centimeter out of position, Alexander would correct them with surgical precision. This was a man who believed that flawless appearances proved flawless leadership. As the staff left the room one by one, the building maintenance engineer, an older Ghanaian man named Mr. Diallo, walked in with a clipboard. He checked the bolts beneath the desk, frowning. 2 months earlier, he had submitted a warning report indicating that the desk was structurally flawed, installed without the weight distribution plates required, without reinforcement. The glass could crack under pressure, but the report had never reached Alexander. Someone in middle management had rejected it after noting that the CEO would not appreciate being told that his prized furniture was defective. Mr. Diallo sighed. He knew the pressure points. He could see a thin internal stress fracture beginning to develop near the support brace. He tapped the glass lightly and shook his head. "This will not hold," he murmured. He considered writing another report, but he already knew what would happen. Alexander believed his decisions were perfect, his surroundings flawless, his empire unbreakable. People like Patrick and Elijah, the ones who noticed defects, flaws, and truths, were beneath him. Mr. Diallo exhaled slowly, placed his tools back in his bag, and left the room with a silent prayer. The next morning, Patrick and Elijah walked together to school and the job center respectively. Patrick wore a clean shirt, his posture straight but his heart heavy. Elijah walked slowly, clutching his backpack straps, lost in thought. As they reached the school gates, Patrick squeezed his son's shoulder. "No matter what happens, walk in courage." Elijah nodded and hurried into the compound. Patrick headed to the city employment office. The lobby was full of tired men and women sitting in plastic chairs, their faces heavy with the weight of waiting. A young woman behind the counter gave him a form and asked for his work history. Patrick filled it out, but the list looked painfully thin. Decades of honest labor without titles impressive enough to change his fate. He sat for an hour, then 2. Before a counselor called his name, she scanned his resume and sighed slightly. "There are limited openings at the moment, but leave your information. We will call if something appears." Patrick thanked her politely. Though he knew the call might never come, he stepped outside and stared at the sky. The clouds were changing. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but the air felt charged at that exact moment. Inside the grand press hall of Cole Global, journalists, investors, and senior executives were taking their seats. Camera crews adjusted their tripods. Sound technicians clipped microphones to the podium. Alexander Khalifa stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his cufflinks and straightening his tie. He smiled at his reflection with deep self-satisfaction. "This will be a perfect day," he muttered. His executive assistant poked her head into the room. "Sir, they are ready for you." Alexander nodded and strode confidently into the hall. The lights brightened, cameras blinked awake. Reporters leaned forward with pens ready. Alexander stepped behind his glass desk, the same desk he had defended with rage and arrogance the day before. He placed both hands on the top of the desk and prepared to begin his speech. No one in the room knew that within the next 10 minutes, everything, his empire, reputation, and illusion of perfection, would crack just as the glass beneath his hands was already beginning to do. The downfall was coming. And destiny had chosen the most poetic stage possible. The next morning arrived with a storm of attention. And Alexander Khalifa's board of directors gathered for an emergency video meeting that no one could pretend was normal. Their polished backgrounds, office portraits, and imported decor could not hide the truth. The world was watching. And the spotlight was burning. The chairman, an aging magnate named Charles Atabumbo, adjusted his glasses as the live metrics scrolled across a shared screen. Engagement numbers were catastrophic. Millions of negative comments, thousands of media articles, and threats from politicians warning of investigations across the grid of executives' faces. Panic was written in every line because the business empire that once felt untouchable now looked like it was standing on cracked glass. Charles cleared his throat and spoke in a measured tone, but the pressure in his voice was unmistakable. He told the board that Alexander Khalifa had acted impulsively and that the fallout had exceeded every projection their public relations team had built in the last decade. A female board member, Janitor, leaned forward and asked why they were discovering from social media that Elijah had earned high distinction in school examinations. Another executive followed by suggesting someone should have vetted the situation before allowing workers, children near executive floors. Their frustration was not about ethics, but about damage control. Not one person in the meeting mentioned justice, fairness, or humanity. Instead, their energy was focused on brand survival, investor confidence, and the potential collapse of government contracts. Meanwhile, downstairs in the janitorial rest area, Patrick and Elijah sat together on a narrow metal bench, waiting to hear whether the company would honor the labor notice allowing an internal appeal. Patrick's eyes were swollen from another sleepless night, but his posture was upright, because his father had told him that dignity was something no billionaire could take away. Elijah, wearing his faded blue shirt, tried to pretend he was calm, but the long silence in the corridor made his heart race. On the opposite wall, a small TV played a morning news program, and suddenly their story appeared on screen. The anchor detailed the national outrage, summarized the global reaction, and questioned why a corporate leader thought it acceptable to terminate a child for touching a desk. The two watched in silence, neither speaking, because the world was describing their pain for them. Patrick felt a mix of shame and pride. Shame that his family was on TV for a reason he never asked for, and pride that the country had recognized his son's innocence. Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on the screen as a psychologist came on air and argued that the video showed emotional harm, noting that Elijah had been humiliated, recorded, and yelled at over something minor. The expert called for full accountability. Patrick's lips tightened. He was grateful that justice might finally come, but he also knew that justice had an ugly price: exposure, fear, the loss of privacy, and the risk of losing the little stability they had upstairs. The corporate lawyers gathered in a war room to build a shared defense. They prepared statements, excuses, deflections, and even a list of potential scapegoats. Some argued that Patrick should be blamed for bringing his son upstairs. Others wanted to claim the video was misleading, but the head lawyer, a stern woman named Ruth Mensah, shut down every idea that sounded dishonest. She reminded them that lying publicly would destroy the company legally. Instead, she demanded that Alexander issue a statement of accountability. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the meaning. There was no longer a simple exit. They had crossed a line that could reshape workplace laws, corporate protections, and executive accountability in all of Africa. Alexander, still furious but frightened, paced back and forth in his private office as he reread the board's demands. He felt betrayed, because he had grown up with privilege so consistent that he never learned how to say, "I was wrong." His father was a titan of business, and in their world, apologies were strategic weapons, not moral decisions. Alexander convinced himself he was the one being victimized by the situation. He believed the public had misunderstood him. The media had exaggerated, And his critics were jealous of his status, but the numbers scrolling across his phone didn't lie. Major clients were issuing ultimatums. The stock price was dropping, lawsuits were being drafted, and one government minister was demanding an inquiry. Elijah spent the afternoon sitting at home with Patrick, their neighbor Auntie Grace, and a church elder who came to pray for their peace. Elijah's mother had passed away years ago, so community figures filled the gap in ways only African neighborhoods understood. Grace held Elijah's hand and told him that children should never be blamed for adults' pride, and that he was not in trouble with God or society. Elijah nodded, but inside he carried weight deeper than his age. He asked Patrick something that pierced the room. Why do powerful people get angry over small things? Patrick took a long breath before answering that power often grows without wisdom. And sometimes position hides a person's weakness rather than strengthening their character. Elijah didn't fully understand, but he felt the truth of his father's words that evening. Activists held a press conference outside Khalifa Tower, dozens of microphones pointed at Tunda Daimi, the same activist from Part 1 who had helped amplify the video online. He spoke with calm intensity, listing decades of workplace mistreatment against cleaners, security men, messengers, and junior staff. He argued that Patrick and Elijah were not an isolated case, but a mirror of a larger system where respect flowed only upward, never downward. Nearby, journalists scribbled quotes as major labor unions released newly drafted demands: protections for janitors' children, mandatory workers' rights training for executives, and disciplinary oversight for any manager who abused power. The movement had grown beyond the desk incident. It was now about dignity at every level of African corporate life. Inside his mansion, Alexander turned on the TV and watched the coverage with tightening fists. He couldn't understand why people were defending a janitor and a boy when he, a titan of industry, was supposedly the true victim of public scrutiny. His ego couldn't tolerate losing control of the narrative. He decided to call a crisis consultant from abroad, someone known for reshaping public opinion through aggressive storytelling. When she appeared on the screen, she asked him a single question: what do you want, truth or victory? Alexander didn't think before answering. He wanted victory. Even if truth had to be reshaped along the way. The consultant drafted a talking point strategy: paint the incident as a security concern, question the appropriateness of a child on executive floors, and portray the online reaction as an overblown emotional response. Alexander liked the plan immediately, but before they finalized it, a staff member burst into the room with breaking news. A journalist had found Elijah's school portfolio and was preparing to publish it. The file showed Elijah had the highest national math score in his age group, ranking number 1 across thousands of students, and the revelation included a detail no one had known. Elijah had recently been selected for an International Youth Innovation Scholarship, pending corporate sponsorship for travel. Alexander sat down slowly as the weight of this new information washed over him. He had humiliated a prodigy. He had screamed at a child who might shape the future of the nation's engineering, architecture, or mathematics industries. The implications were catastrophic. Investors would now question not only his judgment, but his ability to recognize talent. The consultant watched him silently, understanding that public backlash was about to intensify to levels beyond PR rescue. At dawn the next morning, a newspaper headline set the city on fire: Billionaire fires child math prodigy over a DESK. Within hours, parents' groups, academic unions, student associations, and children's advocacy foundations joined the protest. They argued that Elijah embodied the future Africa needed: intelligent, hardworking, and raised with values of humility and respect. Social media filled with student videos titled #WeAreElijah, where children touched school desks, smiled into their cameras, and challenged the idea that touching an object could ever destroy someone's livelihood. The movement transformed Elijah from a boy in the wrong place at the wrong time into a symbol of brilliance, punished by arrogance. Inside the janitorial lounge the following day, Patrick received a phone call from a man who introduced himself as Barrister Daniel I, a respected labor and civil rights attorney. He said his firm would represent the family free of charge and would pursue corporate accountability aggressively. Patrick, overwhelmed, asked why they were helping. The lawyer replied that this case was not just about Patrick. This case was about millions of workers who needed someone brave enough to be first. Patrick promised to discuss it with Elijah and thanked the man sincerely before hanging up. Shortly afterward, the intercom buzzed, and Patrick was asked to report to a small conference room. He entered with Elijah at his side, and a junior HR officer told him that the company was reviewing its options. They offered apologies that felt scripted, half-hearted, and incomplete. They suggested a possible return to work under new procedural guidelines. But Patrick saw clearly that they wanted only to freeze the pressure from outside. He turned down the offer respectfully, saying that they had not apologized to his son publicly, nor admitted that their treatment had been unjust. The HR officer looked stunned, because workers rarely refused anything from the executive floors. But Patrick had reached the point where self-respect mattered more than immediate survival. Hours later, Alexander received word that Patrick had declined reinstatement. His pride reacted before his strategy could. He shouted that the janitor was ungrateful and needed reminding of his place. But his assistant reminded him that someone was already checking whether the disciplinary process had violated labor codes. If the investigation went against them, he could be facing fines, suspension, or a forced removal from the board. Alexander realized that if he didn't pivot soon, the company could lose everything, including his family's century-long legacy. As evening fell, Patrick and Elijah sat outside their small apartment with their neighbors, who brought snacks, water, and warmth. One elderly man with a cane started telling stories about how, in his youth, factory workers changed laws after staging a peaceful protest that lasted 12 days. Elijah listened intently, learning that history was shaped not by the powerful, but by ordinary people who refused to bow. Across the compound, children practiced small speeches in support of Elijah's upcoming hearing, and even the neighborhood tailor was preparing a special shirt for Elijah to wear. It had the phrase, "We rise by dignity," embroidered just above the pocket far away. In a boardroom filled with tension, the directors stared at Alexander one last time and told him the truth plainly. His leadership had triggered the largest public relations disaster in the company's existence. Their accounting officer reported that share value was collapsing rapidly and that a coalition of major clients was planning to dissolve their partnerships for the first time. Alexander felt a chill in his bones because he understood that money could protect him from small scandals, but not from a national rejection. The board announced that, effective immediately, there would be a public disciplinary tribunal to determine whether he should remain in his position. The room fell silent. Alexander, a billionaire who had never once been publicly challenged in his adult life, finally realized he was no longer in control. Decisions would no longer be made in quiet phone calls and discreet dinners. His fate would now be decided in the same open court of opinion where Elijah had been judged first. And as midnight rolled toward a new day, a national news bulletin announced that the tribunal would be broadcast publicly. The country exhaled together. True justice was finally standing up to wealth this time. Everyone was watching. The morning of the public tribunal arrived like a national holiday. But instead of celebration, the air was thick with expectation. Outside the Federal Corporate Compliance Hall, crowds gathered behind security barricades, holding placards with phrases like "Dignity cannot be fired," "Children deserve protection," and "Accountability has no clock." Television cameras rolled from dawn, reporters whispered into microphones, and street vendors sold water and roasted corn to the thousands who had traveled from across the city. It wasn't just about Patrick or Elijah anymore. It was about the millions of workers who had served quietly for decades, believing that respect was something given only upward. Today, for the first time in a generation, respect was flowing in the opposite direction. Inside the enormous courtroom, the atmosphere was strangely still. Executives, journalists, labor leaders, and government officials filled the seats, watching with sharp eyes as the tribunal officers took their positions. At the small wooden table near the front sat Patrick and Elijah, accompanied by Barrister Daniel I, who spread out his documents with calm professionalism. Patrick wore his simple work shirt, And Elijah wore the new tailored shirt from the neighborhood tailor with the words "We rise by dignity" embroidered neatly above the pocket. The hall cameras kept drifting toward the boy, because even in silence, Elijah embodied something powerful: innocence facing a system much larger than itself across the room. Alexander Khalifa entered with his team of corporate attorneys. He tried to maintain the confident posture that had defined him for years, but his shoulders were slightly tense, and his expression held the discomfort of a man unprepared for real accountability. Reporters scribbled frantic notes, capturing every subtle shift in his demeanor, because this was the first time in his life he was forced to answer in a space where his money could not end the conversation. He sat at the opposing table and tapped a pen against his palm, a nervous habit that betrayed his internal uncertainty. The lead tribunal officer, Justice Otieno, a respected former jurist known for unbiased decisions, struck the wooden block and announced that the proceedings had begun. He briefly outlined the purpose: to determine whether the firing of a child recorded, circulated, and globally condemned violated corporate standards, labor protections, child ethics codes, and national workplace dignity regulations. His voice was steady, echoing across the vast chamber, and when he finished, he invited Barrister I to present the opening remarks for Patrick and Elijah. Daniel stood slowly and spoke with a tone that blended compassion and precision. He described Patrick's long years of loyal service, Elijah's innocence, and the emotional trauma inflicted when Alexander launched into a public tirade over a harmless act. He emphasized that Elijah had not vandalized, broken, or damaged anything. He had simply touched a desk, a piece of furniture, not a relic or heritage artifact. Then he introduced copies of the school portfolio, demonstrating that Elijah was not a troublemaker but a top-performing student recognized nationwide. The courtroom listened intently as Daniel argued that the firing revealed systemic problems in how corporations treated their lowest-ranking workers, especially cleaners, security guards, messengers, gardeners, and cooks, when it was the corporation's turn. Their attorneys attempted to paint the situation as a breach of security protocol. They argued that executive floors required strict boundaries and that the firing was a response to process violation. But Justice Otieno paused the attorney with a sharp but polite question: was the firing proportional to the child's action? The corporate lawyer hesitated, because everyone in that room, and the millions watching from homes and offices, knew the answer: it was not. Then, in a development that electrified the courtroom, Justice Otieno ordered that the video be played on the giant screen mounted above the chamber. The hall fell completely silent as the video replayed Alexander shouting at Elijah, his voice shaking with anger, while the boy stood frozen at the edge of the executive desk. Observers watched the moment Elijah's eyes widened, the moment Patrick rushed in to protect his son, and the moment Alexander pronounced the cold words that shattered their world: "You're fired, get out." When the video ended, the silence in the hall was louder than any applause. Justice Otieno allowed a 5-minute recess for the weight of the footage to settle, and people exited into the hallway to talk feverishly outside. Giant digital screens replayed the same footage to thousands waiting at the gates. On social media, reactions multiplied, hashtags surged, and new news outlets snapped updated headlines, and people across the continent shared their disbelief. The event was no longer a corporate dispute. It had become a national discussion on the line between discipline and humiliation. Meanwhile, back inside, the tribunal reconvened and Justice Otieno invited Patrick himself to speak. Patrick rose slowly, adjusting his sleeves, and began telling the story of his life, not dramatically, but simply and honestly. He spoke about joining the company many years ago, working night shifts to raise Elijah alone after losing his wife, and believing that honest labor could build a good future. He spoke about the pride he felt on the day the company allowed workers to bring their children to see the office environment, explaining how he wanted Elijah to glimpse the world that ambition could build. But then Patrick described the humiliation, how he felt his heart break as his child stood terrified in front of strangers. He told the tribunal that he did not blame the company. He blamed the culture of imbalance that allowed someone to believe a desk carried more importance than a human heart. As he finished, he bowed his head, and in the audience several people wiped tears from their eyes. Then, the tribunal requested to hear from Elijah. The room shifted as microphones were adjusted downward so the boy could reach them. Elijah spoke softly but clearly, saying that he did not mean to cause trouble, that he had just been curious about how a glass desk looked up close. He explained that he liked engineering because he wanted to understand how strong things were built. He told them he thought adults always said children should be curious. He then asked the tribunal something pure and piercing. Is curiosity a mistake if you are not rich? The courtroom froze. The question landed like a moral hammer that reached beyond corporate policy into the soul of society itself. Alexander shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time his confident mask cracked. He realized, perhaps truly for the first time in his life, that the boy in front of him was not a rival, not a nuisance, but simply a child who wanted to understand the world. The weight of his actions pressed into him, and he swallowed difficulty during cross-examination. The corporation's lawyers attempted to ask Elijah about whether he had received permission to be upstairs, but before they could continue, the tribunal chair intervened, reminding them that Elijah was a minor and that hostile questioning of a child in a disciplinary proceeding was inappropriate. The corporation's lawyers stepped back, and that moment quietly demonstrated that the legal power was shifting away from those accustomed to controlling the narrative. Next, several surprise witnesses were allowed to speak. Workers from the same company, a middle-aged security guard named Samuel Boateng, explained that Elijah was always polite, hardworking at school, and never caused problems on visits. A veteran cleaner, Flora Kanadu, recounted how she had seen Alexander verbally mistreat junior staff in the past, but no one dared report it for fear of losing their job. Her testimony confirmed what many suspected: the desk incident was not isolated, but part of a wider culture in which power flowed in only one direction. The final witness for the day was Janitor, a board member who had voted for the tribunal. She confessed that for years the executive leadership had ignored reports about worker mistreatment. She admitted that the company's culture rewarded speed, results, and efficiency but failed to reward humanity, patience, or empathy. Her voice did not tremble, but her face showed the emotional cost of telling the truth against colleagues she had known for years. When she finished, the courtroom remained still because everyone recognized the significance. Someone from the top had broken the wall of silence. Justice Otieno closed the day's proceedings with a statement that the tribunal would reconvene in 48 hours to discuss sanctions, penalties, and possible disciplinary orders. He reminded everyone that the purpose of this inquiry was not to destroy individuals but to restore balance in a system where power had grown disconnected from the people it served. He rang the block sharply, and the session came to an end. Outside, the air erupted again. A river of reporters flooded toward Patrick, Elijah, and Barrister I. Microphones pointed in every direction, and a young journalist asked Elijah how he felt. Elijah looked up and replied with a small, steady voice, "I just want to go to school and learn. I didn't think this would become so big, but I'm thankful for everyone who supported us." His words became a soundbite repeated across every major station that evening. On the other side of the courthouse steps, Alexander faced an entirely different scene. Reporters hurled questions about arrogance, ethical responsibility, and leadership failure. Some asked whether he would resign. Others questioned whether his apology, yet to be issued in full, was just a strategy rather than sincere accountability. Alexander remained silent and was hurried into a car by his assistants, but as the car door closed, he glimpsed the crowds not as faceless critics but as citizens hurt by a system he had benefited from his entire life. That night, social media exploded again. University students published open letters demanding that corporations adopt dignity codes. Editorial writers compared Elijah's question, "Is curiosity a mistake if you are not rich?" to earlier historical moments that shifted national consciousness. Review panels debated how corporate disciplines should intersect with moral consideration. For the first time, the country was united across class lines. Even executives who usually remained quiet began sending internal memos demanding change in Patrick and Elijah's neighborhood. People gathered in the courtyard, turning the event into a community watch party. Someone set up a projector on the compound wall, and families sat on plastic chairs, sofas dragged from living rooms, and stools borrowed from kitchens. Children played tag in the corner, while adults discussed what the tribunal meant for their own workplaces. Auntie Grace served a spicy puff-puff to everyone, saying that win or lose, Elijah had already forced the country to face a truth long ignored. Back in his mansion, Alexander sat alone in his study. His house was enormous, full of imported furniture, marble floors, and framed diplomas that celebrated his business successes. Yet, for the first time, none of those things comforted him. He stared at the headlines on his tablet, watched the footage of Patrick speaking from the heart, and felt an unfamiliar sensation tightening inside him. Regretty remembered his childhood, growing up far above the struggles of ordinary people, surrounded by privileges that were offered freely without question. His father had taught him that wealth protected those who controlled it, and that leadership meant never admitting weakness. But as he watched Elijah's small voice echo across the screen, he realized how deeply that teaching had distorted his understanding of humanity. He whispered to himself, "How did I not see it?" But no answer came in that quiet room filled with symbols of worldly achievement. Alexander finally understood something simple but transformative. Authority without empathy was not leadership, it was failure. Meanwhile, Barrister Patrick, and Elijah held a modest dinner at home that evening. Nothing luxurious, just stew, bread, and boiled yum, but the warmth made it feel like a victory. The lawyer explained that the next hearing would determine consequences, corporate penalties, possible public apologies, or even sanctions on Alexander personally. Patrick listened carefully and asked only one question: if they apologize sincerely and change their policies, can we consider this resolved? Daniel smiled, saying that that decision belonged entirely to Patrick and Elijah. The lawyer knew justice did not always mean destruction. Sometimes justice meant transformation. As the night deepened, Elijah sat by the window looking up at the stars, wondering why a piece of furniture had led to national debate. But then he remembered what his father always said, that sometimes the world changed not when important people spoke, but when ordinary people refused to remain silent. He did not know yet what the tribunal's verdict would be, but he knew that he and his father were no longer alone. A whole country was standing with the man across the city. Thousands of workers went to bed believing something they had not believed in a long time. Maybe tomorrow the system could finally bend toward fairness, because this time the boy who touched a desk had touched something much greater, the conscience of a nation. The city had woken to a quiet tension, as if it sensed that the tribunal's final session would decide more than just Patrick and Elijah's fate. People filled the streets near the courthouse again, carrying banners and shouting chants in a rhythm that felt both ceremonial and urgent. News vans lined every street corner, their satellite dishes scanning the sky for a perfect signal. In offices across Lagos, Accra, and Nairobi, employees paused at their desks to stream the proceedings live. Even the children who had followed Elijah's story from the neighborhood compound the previous day were glued to tiny screens, whispering prayers under their breath. Inside the Federal Corporate Compliance Hall, Justice Otieno called the session to order. Today would determine accountability. Today would confirm whether wealth could be allowed to humiliate innocence. Today would test the balance between corporate authority and moral conscience. Patrick and Elijah entered together, holding hands, their presence calm but commanding. Elijah's shirt, neatly ironed and embroidered with "We rise by dignity," seemed to radiate something far larger than cloth and thread. It symbolized a movement, a moral challenge, and the awakening of collective conscience. Barrister Daniel followed them, carrying bundles of documents that reinforced the case: labor violations, records of previous minor complaints about executive misconduct, school portfolios, and testimonials from colleagues who had long witnessed abuse in silence. Alexander Khalifa entered last, flanked by his corporate attorneys. His stride was deliberate, his expression controlled, but the faint tremor of unease betrayed the weight he now carried. Cameras swiveled toward him. Every reporter Every citizen watching from home sensed that the once untouchable billionaire was now vulnerable. The grandeur of the hall, with its polished floors, high ceilings, and golden chandeliers, did nothing to shield him from the truth. He had underestimated the power of a child's dignity. Justice Otieno spoke first. Outlining the scope of the tribunal's authority, he emphasized that the goal was not vengeance, but the establishment of precedent, that no child, no employee, and no citizen could be humiliated under the guise of authority. He stressed that the tribunal would issue not only sanctions but also recommendations for systemic reform, aiming to prevent the repetition of this incident in any corporation across the country. Testimony that shocked the ROM barrister. I began by presenting new evidence gathered overnight. First, he shared screenshots of hundreds of social media posts, videos, and messages from students, parents, teachers, and ordinary citizens praising Elijah's intelligence and integrity. Then he introduced the results of an independent evaluation confirming Elijah's extraordinary aptitude in mathematics and science. Graphs showed national rankings, awards, and scholarship opportunities, emphasizing that the child's potential could impact not just his own future, but the country's educational and technological development. The tribunal officers leaned forward, eyes scanning the data with careful attention. Justice Otieno paused, raising a finger. Is this child a prodigy? He asked softly. Elijah nodded, cheeks slightly pink but eyes steady. The hall murmured for the first time. Alexander's carefully constructed narrative that the boy was an intruder seemed utterly hollow. Next, several employees testified about the toxic environment at Coal Global. Samuel Boateng, the security guard, recalled years of minor humiliations he had endured without recourse. Flora Kanadu, the veteran cleaner, detailed shifted in his seat, jaw tight, fingers drumming nervously. No prepared statements, no polished excuses, no consultant's talking points could undo the reality the public had already judged. And the tribunal was formalizing that judgment. Turning point. Then came the most dramatic moment. The tribunal requested a live demonstration of the desk's structural integrity. A certified engineer, Aang Musa Abimbala, entered the chamber with a heavy steel rod and explained that the Italian glass desk, admired for its craftsmanship, had a critical defect in its support system. He carefully applied weight to the desk, demonstrating how pressure from the center could crack the surface. Cameras captured every angle, streaming the footage to millions online. Alexander's face paled. He had never imagined that the object he revered, the desk that symbolized his empire, was literally flawed. Worse, he realized that had Elijah's hand pressed harder, a catastrophic crack could have occurred. But instead of focusing on potential danger, Patrick and Elijah had admired the craftsmanship, touched with innocent curiosity, and paid the price with humiliation. Justice Otieno's voice rang clear. This incident reveals not only an ethical failure, but a practical one. The child did not endanger property. The child demonstrated curiosity, respect, and ingenuity, yet he was punished unjustly. That is unacceptable. The tribunal then turned to Alexander for his statement. He rose, voice wavering slightly, and admitted for the first time publicly that his reaction had been excessive and that he had failed to recognize the value of humility and respect. Social media erupted across the city. People shared the statement, dissected its sincerity, and debated its meaning. Some applauded the apology. Others waited for more substantial action. THECONSEQUNC. Justice Otieno proceeded to deliver the tribunal's findings. Immediate reinstatement of Patrick and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The company must issue a formal apology to both father and son. Financial penalties and donations. Coal Global was required to fund scholarships for high-achieving students from underprivileged backgrounds, including Elijah. Corporate reform mandates all executives were to undergo training in workplace ethics, child protection, and employee dignity within 6 months. Monitoring and oversight. A government-appointed committee would oversee compliance with these mandates, ensuring the company could no longer mistreat staff under the guise of authority. The hall erupted in applause. Patrick clasped Elijah's shoulder. The boy's eyes glistened, not with triumph over Alexander, But with the relief of truth finally prevailing outside, crowds cheered, parents held children aloft, workers chanted, knowing that the tribunal had sent a powerful message. Dignity mattered more than hierarchy, curiosity mattered more than fear. And no child was beneath the protection of justice. Aftermath in public respo and se. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed across newspapers. Child genius wins against billionaire tyrant. The desk that shook a nation. Curiosity trumps arrogance. Elijah's story goes global. Social media became a platform for national dialogue. Teachers shared the story with students, using it as a lesson in ethics and courage. Business leaders reassessed internal practices, auditing how they treated employees. Children everywhere were reminded that curiosity was sacred and that their value could never be measured by wealth, status, or fear. Alexander faced an entirely new reality for the first time. Power alone could not shield him from public scrutiny. His apology, while sincere, was only the beginning of rebuilding not just a reputation, but a moral compass. He called meetings with executives and implemented reforms, acknowledging that leadership required more than strategy, it required empathy, humility, and accountability. COMMUNITYCLEBRAIO. And back in their neighborhood, the compound was alive with celebration. Elders shared wisdom. Children sang songs of courage and curiosity. And neighbors brought food and decorations. Elijah and Patrick were the honored guests. Yet the focus was not on fame but on the principle that justice and dignity had prevailed. Anti-Grace, tears in her eyes, whispered to Patrick, "Your son has reminded the world that even the smallest hands can carry the weight of truth." Elijah, still processing the whirlwind, whispered back, "Daddy, we didn't even touch the desk wrong, we just touched it right." Patrick smiled, realizing that his son had not only survived adversity, but had become a symbol of what the world had long needed to remember. Innocence, courage, and respect are stronger than fear, anger, or wealth. Elijah Ah's future. Within weeks, Elijah was awarded scholarships to attend a prestigious international science camp. Universities offered mentorship programs. Inventors and engineers reached out, inviting him to collaborate on youth innovation projects. Patrick, once limited by his labor and income, now found that doors were opening not because of money, but because of integrity and courage. Their lives had been transformed, not by wealth but by a profound moral truth. Justice could ripple outward, changing the trajectory of generations. Alexander, meanwhile, committed publicly to creating educational foundations for underprivileged children, restructuring the corporate culture at Cole Global, and personally mentoring executives in ethics and compassion. It was a transformation many doubted. Yet the tribunal's ruling, coupled with the public's watchful eye, made sincerity inevitable. The nation had witnessed something extraordinary. A single act of injustice against a child had catalyzed a movement for dignity, accountability, and ethical leadership across Africa. Every media outlet, classroom, and workplace carried the story. The lesson was clear and enduring. No amount of wealth or status can justify cruelty, and no act of curiosity should be punished. Weeks passed since the tribunal, but the impact of Elijah's story was still echoing through every corner of the nation. Schools held assemblies, teaching children that curiosity and courage were gifts, not liabilities. Corporations revisited policies, instituting formal dignity codes and employee protection programs. Social media continued to celebrate Elijah's resilience, while journalists wrote in-depth features on Patrick's steadfast parenting and Alexander Khalifa's transformation. The story had become more than news, it had become a cultural moment, a lesson in accountability, humility, and justice. For Patrick and Elijah, life had changed in ways they never anticipated. Patrick no longer felt the invisible weight of fear that had hung over him for years. He could walk through streets without looking over his shoulder, knowing that the world recognized the dignity in his family. His work as a janitor continued, but now with newfound respect from colleagues and supervisors alike. Elijah, meanwhile, was thriving academically and personally. The scholarship he received allowed him to explore his genius without constraints, and the attention he garnered inspired other young minds across the continent. Children who had once feared making mistakes now dared to explore, to question, to imagine, knowing that curiosity could never be punished. Alexander Khalifa, once consumed by pride and arrogance, had been forced into a profound personal reckoning. The tribunal, the media, and public scrutiny had stripped away the illusions of untouchable power, leaving him to confront the moral failures that had shaped his decisions. In a carefully organized press conference, he publicly apologized to Patrick, Elijah, and the nation. He committed to supporting educational initiatives for underprivileged children and implementing corporate reforms to prevent future injustices. While some doubted the sincerity of his transformation, others believed that the consequences of his actions had awakened a long-dormant sense of empathy. The billionaire had learned, in the most humbling way, that authority is meaningless without humanity beyond the individuals involved. The incident sparked a broader conversation about systemic issues. Community leaders, educators, and activists collaborated to create programs that promoted dignity in every workplace and encouraged mentorship for young talent, particularly children from low-income families. National policies began emphasizing the protection of minors in corporate environments, and stories like Elijah's became central examples in ethics, training, and leadership courses. The narrative had transcended a single act of injustice, evolving into a movement that reminded Africa and the world that moral courage could disrupt entrenched hierarchies and reshape society. In their neighborhood, life returned to a peaceful rhythm, but with a heightened sense of hope and pride. Children played freely, inspired by Elijah's courage, while neighbors discussed the changes in corporate culture and society with newfound optimism. Patrick and Elijah were welcomed everywhere they went, not as celebrities but as symbols of integrity and perseverance. They continued their modest routines, attending church gatherings, community meetings, and local events, always mindful that their story was now intertwined with the lives of countless others who sought justice, respect, and opportunity. Elijah himself began reflecting on the lessons of the ordeal. He realized that power is not defined by wealth, status, or authority, but by the courage to stand for what is right. He understood that mistakes and curiosity are not weaknesses, they are the seeds of innovation, learning, and moral growth. Even the humiliation, fear, and injustice he endured had become part of a larger narrative that taught resilience, empathy, and leadership. Every night as he prepared for school or studied complex problems in mathematics and science, he carried with him a quiet strength born from both challenge and triumph. Patrick, too, experienced profound growth. He had always known the value of hard work, dignity, and perseverance, but the ordeal reinforced the belief that standing up for what is right, even when the odds are stacked against you, can transform lives. He became more involved in community advocacy, mentoring younger parents and organizing workshops on parenting, ethics, and civic responsibility. His story inspired not only families in his neighborhood but also individuals across the nation, proving that courage and integrity can create ripples far beyond what one might imagine. The lessons of this story extended into boardrooms, classrooms, and homes. Leaders across industries began to ask themselves critical questions. How do we treat those with less power? Are we fostering curiosity and growth or suppressing it out of fear? How do we balance authority with empathy? Elijah's story became a case study in moral leadership, reminding those in positions of power that wealth cannot shield one from accountability, and that respect and humanity must always guide decision-making. As time went on, the memory of the incident with the glass desk became a symbol rather than a source of pain. Elijah no longer feared mistakes. Patrick no longer feared injustice. The country learned a profound truth: dignity and courage, even in the smallest hands, can topple arrogance, inspire reform, and awaken the conscience of a nation. The story of the janitor's son, who was fired for touching a desk, had become a tale of triumph over injustice, proof that integrity and truth will always rise, even against towering wealth and authority. In quiet moments, Elijah would often sit by the window of their modest home, reflecting on the journey from fear to recognition. He would look at the stars and imagine a future where children everywhere could explore, learn, and grow without fear of humiliation. Patrick, watching his son, knew that the ordeal had strengthened their bond and taught them lessons no wealth could buy. They had endured injustice, faced a titan of industry, and emerged not just intact but morally victorious ultimately. The story left an enduring mark on society. It reminded the nation and the world that justice is not the privilege of the powerful but the right of all. It demonstrated that courage, integrity, and moral clarity can challenge entrenched systems and reshape cultural values. It showed that even in a world obsessed with wealth and status, the voice of a child and the steadfastness of a parent could inspire change, awaken conscience, and ensure that dignity triumphs over arrogance. The janitor and his son, once ordinary and overlooked, had now become living symbols of what it means to stand firm, speak truth, and honor the principles that define humanity. Their story was a testament to the idea that no matter how high the walls of wealth or power may rise, the light of integrity, courage, and justice will always find a way to shine through. Before we end today's story, remember this: Elijah was just a boy and his father just a janitor. Yet their courage and integrity changed the course of a nation. This is a story not about wealth, power, or status. It's about standing for what is right, even when the world underestimates you. If you feel inspired, if your heart resonates with their journey, don't let this story end here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapter, because every week we bring real-life dramas, emotional triumphs, and stories that inspire us all.